Jake lived alone in a small, quiet suburb where nothing much ever happened. His life was simple, predictable even. He liked it that way. Every morning, he would wake up early, drink a cup of coffee while reading the news, and then head out to work. It wasn't glamorous, but it suited him just fine. That all changed when Karen moved in next door. Karen was everything Jake wasn't: loud, flashy, and completely oblivious to how her actions affected others. She had arrived one weekend with boxes stacked high in the back of her oversized red SUV. By Monday morning, she'd already made herself known. Her music blared late into the night, disturbing the peace Jake cherished so deeply. But what really got under his skin was her habit of parking right in front of his driveway every single day. At first, Jake thought it might have been a mistake. Maybe she didn't realize that parking there blocked him from pulling out easily. So he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. On the second day, he walked over to her house after seeing the SUV parked in the same spot again. Karen answered the door with a bright smile, her blonde hair tied up in a messy bun. "Hi," Jake said politely. "I noticed your car is parked kind of close to my driveway. I was wondering if you could park somewhere else. It's making it hard for me to get out." Karen tilted her head slightly, her smile fading just a little. "Oh, really?" she asked, sounding surprised. "I didn't think it was a big deal. I'll try to remember not to do it again." Jake nodded, feeling relieved. "Thanks. I appreciate it." But the next morning, the SUV was back in the same spot. This time, Jake left a note on her windshield. "Please don't park here. It blocks my driveway." He hoped the written reminder would make her take notice. When he came home from work that evening, he found the note crumpled on the ground near her tires. Clearly, Karen hadn't bothered to read it, or worse, she had ignored it entirely. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's behavior didn't change. If anything, it got worse. Not only did she continue to park in front of his driveway, but she also started leaving earlier and returning later, meaning her SUV often sat there for hours at a time. Jake grew more frustrated with each passing day. He tried talking to her again, this time with less patience. "Look," he said firmly during their second conversation, "you're blocking my driveway almost every day. Can you please find another place to park?" Karen sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Jake, I don't know why you're being so difficult about this. It's just a few minutes of inconvenience. Why are you letting it ruin your mood?" "It's not just a few minutes," Jake replied through gritted teeth. "It happens every day, and it's my property. You shouldn't be parking there at all." Karen waved him off dismissively. "Fine, whatever. I'll see what I can do," but she didn't do anything. The very next morning, her SUV was back in its usual spot. Jake felt powerless. He considered calling the police, but he knew they wouldn't intervene unless there was actual damage or danger involved. Parking disputes weren't exactly high on their list of priorities. Besides, Karen seemed to have won over most of the neighbors with her charm. She hosted block parties and baked cookies for everyone, earning their favor effortlessly. When Jake mentioned the problem to a couple of them, they shrugged it off. "Why don't you just park on the street?" one neighbor suggested. "It's not that big of a deal." "It is a big deal," Jake muttered under his breath, though he kept his frustration to himself. He hated feeling like the bad guy, especially when he believed he was in the right. As the weeks dragged on, Jake began to feel trapped in his own home. Being late to work became a regular occurrence thanks to Karen's constant obstruction. His boss had already pulled him aside once to discuss his punctuality issues. Jake wanted to explain that it wasn't his fault, but he doubted anyone would understand. How could he possibly justify blaming his tardiness on a nosy neighbor who refused to respect boundaries? One particularly bad morning, Jake snapped. He had been running late because of yet another encounter with Karen's SUV. As he finally managed to squeeze past it and speed toward the office, he realized something needed to change, and fast. He couldn't keep letting Karen walk all over him. There had to be a way to teach her a lesson without stooping to her level. That evening, Jake sat in his living room staring at the blank TV screen, lost in thought. He replayed every interaction he'd had with Karen, analyzing her reactions and trying to figure out what made her tick. One thing was clear: she thrived on attention. Whether it was throwing parties or showing off her expensive car, Karen loved being the center of everyone's world. Taking that away from her might just be the key to breaking her cycle of entitlement. An idea began to form in Jake's mind. At first it seemed extreme, maybe even unethical, but the more he thought about it, the more appealing it became. If Karen wouldn't listen to reason, then perhaps she needed to experience a taste of her own medicine. Jake smiled faintly as the pieces fell into place. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next step was enlisting help. Jake picked up his phone and dialed Brian, his childhood friend who lived across town. Brian was tech-savvy and always eager to lend a hand, especially when it came to pranks. After explaining the situation, Jake pitched his plan. "I need something that will mess with her car," Jake said. "Something subtle enough that she won't suspect anything right away." Brian chuckled. "You're serious about this, huh? All right, let me see what I can dig up online. I'll call you back tomorrow." Hanging up, Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. He knew revenge wasn't the noblest path, but desperation had pushed him to this point. All he could do now was wait and prepare for the next phase of his plan. For the rest of the night, Jake kept glancing out the window at Karen's SUV, now parked smugly in its usual spot. Tomorrow things would be different. Tomorrow, Karen would learn that no one messed with Jake and got away with it. The next morning, Jake woke up earlier than usual. He couldn't sleep much anyway, his mind racing with thoughts about the plan he had discussed with Brian. By noon, Brian called back, sounding excited. "All right, I found something that might work," he said over the phone. "It's a gadget you can use to interfere with her car's electronics. Nothing major, just enough to annoy her." Jake felt a mix of relief and nervousness. "Where do I get it?" he asked. "I ordered it for you already," Brian replied. "It should arrive in a couple of days. Just don't do anything too crazy, okay? We're not trying to hurt anyone here." "Don't worry," Jake assured him. "I just want to teach her a lesson." When the package arrived, Jake tore it open eagerly. Inside was a small black box, no bigger than a deck of cards, along with instructions on how to use it. The device looked harmless enough, but Jake knew its potential. With this little gadget, he could remotely disrupt Karen's car, locking the doors, honking the horn, or even preventing it from starting. It wasn't dangerous, but it would definitely be annoying. Brian came over that evening to help Jake set everything up. They sat in Jake's garage, surrounded by tools and wires, as Brian explained how the device worked. "You'll need to place it somewhere close to her car," Brian said, pointing at the tiny box. "Once it's activated, you can control it using your phone. But remember, keep it subtle. You don't want her figuring out what's going on." Jake nodded, taking mental notes. He didn't want to tip Karen off too soon. This needed to feel like random bad luck, not sabotage. As they worked, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, he was taking action, instead of sitting back and letting Karen walk all over him. Meanwhile, Karen remained completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. She went about her life as usual, blissfully ignorant of the resentment she had stirred in Jake. That weekend, she hosted another one of her infamous block parties. Music blared from her backyard, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. Neighbors laughed and chatted, sipping drinks and enjoying themselves. Karen loved being the center of attention, and she basked in the praise her guests showered on her. "You throw the best parties," one neighbor exclaimed, holding a plate piled high with burgers. "How do you manage to make everything look so perfect?" Karen smiled modestly, though her pride was evident. "Oh, it's nothing really," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just a little effort goes a long way." Jake watched from his window, seething. How could everyone fall for her act? Didn't they see how selfish she was? He clenched, his fists tightly, reminding himself why he was doing this. Karen thrived on control and admiration, and Jake was determined to take that away from her, one small step at a time. Finally, the moment came to put the plan into action. Late that night, after the party ended and the neighborhood fell silent, Jake slipped out of his house. He carried the device in his pocket, heart pounding with anticipation. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of crickets. Moonlight bathed the pavement, casting long shadows as Jake crept toward Karen's driveway. Her SUV sat there, gleaming under the soft glow of a nearby street lamp. Jake crouched beside it, carefully placing the device underneath the chassis. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay calm. Once the device was secure, he backed away slowly, making sure not to leave any traces behind. Back inside his house, Jake opened the app on his phone that controlled the device. A wave of adrenaline rushed through him as he tapped the screen to test it. At first, nothing happened. Then the SUV's headlights flickered briefly before turning off again. Jake grinned, feeling a surge of triumph. It worked. Over the next few days, Jake began experimenting with the device, testing its limits while keeping things low-key. One morning, Karen walked out to her car only to find the doors locked. She jingled her keys in confusion, pressing the unlock button repeatedly, but nothing happened. Frustrated, she called a locksmith who eventually fixed the issue. When asked about it later, Karen shrugged it off as a fluke. But Jake wasn't done yet. The following night, he triggered the horn to go off randomly at 2 a.m., startling Karen, awake. She stumbled outside in her robe, looking around suspiciously before muttering something about teenagers playing pranks. Each incident was minor on its own, but together, they started to wear Karen down. Despite these disruptions, Karen refused to believe someone was targeting her. Instead, she convinced herself that her car was simply malfunctioning. "These things happen," she told her friends when they asked about the strange occurrences. "Maybe it's time for an upgrade." Jake listened to her excuses with growing amusement. Every time she dismissed the incidents as coincidence, he felt more confident in his plan. Karen's arrogance blinded her to the truth, and Jake intended to exploit that weakness. As the days passed, Jake noticed subtle changes in Karen's behavior. She seemed more agitated, snapping at neighbors and complaining about bad vibes in the area. Her once perfect facade began to crack, revealing glimpses of the insecurity beneath. Jake savored every moment, knowing he was finally getting through to her. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of his mind warning him to tread carefully. Revenge was satisfying, but it came with risks. If Karen ever discovered what he was doing, the consequences could be severe. Yet Jake pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the thrill of seeing Karen squirm. One afternoon, Brian stopped by to check on Jake's progress. "How's it going?" he asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "It's working. Better than I expected," Jake admitted, showing Brian some videos he'd secretly recorded of Karen struggling with her car. "She has no idea what's happening." Brian laughed but quickly grew serious. "Just be careful, all right? Don't let this spiral out of control." Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. In his mind, Karen deserved every bit of frustration she was experiencing. After months of dealing with her entitled behavior, he felt justified in taking matters into his own hands. That evening, as Jake watched Karen's SUV from his window, he allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had the upper hand. The battle between them was far from over, but Jake was ready to escalate things further if necessary. Whatever it took, he vowed to make Karen regret ever crossing him, and, deep down, he wondered if revenge might come at a cost higher than he anticipated. Jake's plan was working better than he had hoped. Each time he used the device to mess with Karen's SUV, it left her more frazzled and confused. At first, the disruptions were minor, her car refusing to start one morning, or the doors locking unexpectedly when she tried to leave. But as the days went on, Jake grew bolder, pushing the boundaries of what he could do without crossing into dangerous territory. One evening, Jake decided to take things up a notch. He triggered the horn to honk repeatedly in the middle of the night. It started softly at first, just enough to wake Karen, but then it grew louder and more insistent. By the time Karen stumbled outside in her robe, looking disheveled and furious, the noise had drawn the attention of a few neighbors. They peeked out their windows, curious about the commotion. "What is going on?" Karen shouted, slamming her car door shut after finally silencing the horn. She glared around the darkened street, searching for signs of troublemakers. When no one appeared, she muttered under her breath and stormed back inside, slamming her front door behind her. Jake watched from his bedroom window, barely able to contain his laughter. Seeing Karen so rattled gave him a strange sense of satisfaction. For months, she had treated him like an inconvenience, someone whose needs didn't matter. Now he was turning the tables, making her feel powerless and frustrated. As the days turned into weeks, Jake continued to escalate his pranks. One morning, Karen discovered that her headlights had been left on all night, draining her battery. Another time, her car alarm blared for no reason during a quiet afternoon, startling everyone within earshot. Each incident seemed random to Karen, but Jake knew they were anything but. Karen began to lose her composure. Her once polished demeanor cracked under the weight of these unexplained problems. She snapped at neighbors who asked if everything was okay and became increasingly paranoid. "Something weird is going on," she told a friend over coffee one morning. "I think someone's messing with me." Her friend laughed it off. "Maybe it's just bad luck," she suggested. "Cars can be finicky sometimes." But Karen wasn't convinced. "No, this feels deliberate," she insisted. "It's like someone's trying to drive me crazy." Jake listened to her complaints through the thin walls separating their houses, feeling a mix of pride and unease. On one hand, he relished seeing Karen unravel. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the growing tension between them. Every prank brought them closer to a confrontation, and Jake wasn't sure how Karen would react if she ever found out the truth. Despite his reservations, Jake kept going. He justified his actions by reminding himself of all the times Karen had inconvenienced him. She had parked in his driveway daily, ignored his polite requests, and dismissed his frustration as unwarranted. If anyone deserved to be taught a lesson, it was her. One day, Jake decided to test the limits of the device even further. Late at night, after ensuring the neighborhood was asleep, he activated the gadget to turn on Karen's windshield wipers. The rhythmic swishing sound echoed through the quiet streets, loud enough to wake Karen again. This time, however, she didn't come outside immediately. Instead, she called the police. When the officers arrived, Karen explained her suspicions. "Someone's targeting my car," she said, pointing at her SUV. "They've been messing with it for weeks now. I don't know who it is, but it has to stop." The officers inspected the vehicle but found nothing unusual. Without evidence of tampering or vandalism, there wasn't much they could do. "It could just be electrical issues," one officer suggested. "We recommend taking it to a mechanic if it keeps happening." Frustrated and embarrassed, Karen thanked them and sent them on their way. But the encounter only deepened her paranoia. She started parking her SUV in different spots around the neighborhood, hoping to throw off whoever was targeting her. Unfortunately for her, Jake simply adjusted his tactics, placing the device in new locations whenever necessary. Jake noticed that Karen's behavior was changing in other ways too. She became less social, skipping her usual block parties and avoiding conversations with neighbors. Her once immaculate yard began to show signs of neglect, with weeds creeping up along the edges of her flower beds. Even her flashy outfits seemed duller, as though she had lost some of her confidence. Brian noticed the shift when he visited Jake one weekend. "Wow, you really got to her," he said, scrolling through photos Jake had secretly taken of Karen looking flustered. "She looks like a completely different person." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of pride and guilt. "Good," he muttered. "She deserves it." But Brian frowned. "Are you sure this is worth it? You're playing with fire here. What happens if she figures out it's you?" "I've been careful," Jake replied, though doubt lingered in his voice. "Besides, she'll never suspect me. She thinks I'm just a pushover." Brian didn't argue further, but his expression made it clear he wasn't entirely convinced. As much as Jake wanted to believe he was in control, there was always the risk that Karen might uncover the truth. And when that happened, things could get ugly. Despite his friend's concerns, Jake pressed on. He spent hours researching ways to refine his pranks, determined to make each one more effective than the last. One idea stuck out to him: hacking into Karen's smart home system. If he could gain access to her thermostat, lights, and security cameras, he could create chaos inside her house without ever setting foot near it. With Brian's help, Jake purchased a cheap hacking tool online and practiced using it on his own devices. Once he felt confident enough, he set his sights on Karen's house. Late one night, he snuck into her backyard and planted the device near her Wi-Fi router. From there, he gained remote access to her smart home network. The next morning, Karen woke up to find her thermostat set to an unbearably high temperature. Confused and sweating, she adjusted it only for it to reset itself moments later. Later that day, her fridge door swung open randomly while she was cooking dinner, startling her. That night, her voice assistant announced in a cold monotone, "You're not welcome here." Terrified, Karen called the police again, claiming her house was haunted. The officers exchanged skeptical glances but agreed to inspect the property. Again, they found nothing conclusive. "It might be a software glitch," one of them suggested. "Try resetting your devices." Karen followed their advice, but the strange occurrences continued. Her paranoia reached new heights and she began isolating herself even more. Friends stopped inviting her to gatherings, assuming she was too stressed to participate. Neighbors whispered about her erratic behavior, speculating about what might have caused such a dramatic change. Through it all, Jake watched silently, savoring every moment of Karen's downfall. He told himself that justice was being served, that Karen was finally getting a taste of the frustration she had inflicted on him. Yet deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Revenge had consumed him, and he wasn't sure how to stop. One evening, as Jake sat alone in his living room, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His eyes looked tired, almost hollow, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of his obsession. For the first time, he questioned whether this vendetta was truly worth it. Had he gone too far? And if so, was there any way to undo the damage? Jake didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for certain. The game wasn't over, yet. Jake's control over Karen's life grew stronger with each passing day. After hacking into her smart home system, he gained access to almost every aspect of her daily routine. Her thermostat became unpredictable, sometimes freezing cold, other times unbearably hot. Lights flickered on and off without warning, startling her during quiet moments. Even her security cameras turned against her, showing distorted footage or blank screens whenever she tried to review them. Karen's paranoia reached new heights. She spent hours pacing her house, jumping at every sound. Once confident and self-assured, she now seemed fragile, constantly looking over her shoulder, as if someone, or something, was watching her every move. Jake observed all this from afar, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction. Every glitch he caused reminded him that he was finally getting even with Karen for the months of frustration she had inflicted on him. But as time went on, Jake began to notice subtle changes, not just in Karen, but in himself. He found himself obsessing over the details of his revenge plan, spending hours tweaking the settings on her devices or brainstorming new ways to make her life miserable. Nights that used to be peaceful were now filled with restless thoughts about how far he could push things. Was he doing this to teach her a lesson, or had it become something darker? One evening, Jake sat alone in his living room, scrolling through online forums about smart home hacks. His phone buzzed on the table. Next to him, it was Brian calling. Jake hesitated before answering, unsure if he wanted to talk. Eventually, he picked up. "What's going on?" Brian asked bluntly. "You've been quiet lately." "Nothing," Jake replied quickly. "Just busy with work." Brian sighed. "Come on, man. Don't give me that. I can tell something's up. Are you still messing with Karen?" Jake hesitated, again. He didn't want to admit how consumed he'd become by his vendetta, but lying felt wrong too. "Yeah, I am," he admitted quietly. "But it's working. She's falling apart." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Brian spoke. "Listen, I get why you're doing this. She treated you like garbage, and no one deserves that. But you need to ask yourself, where does it end? What happens when she figures out it's you? Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. She won't figure it out, he said defensively. I've been careful. And what if she does? Brian pressed. Then what? You think she's just going to shrug it off and move on? This could blow up in your face, Jake. Jake didn't respond right away. Deep down, he knew Brian was right. Revenge might feel good in the moment, but it rarely solved anything in the long run. Still, he couldn't bring himself to stop. Seeing Karen unravel gave him a strange sense of power, a reminder that he wasn't as powerless as she had made him feel. The next morning, Karen woke up to find her voice assistant announcing cryptic messages throughout the house. You'll never win, it said in its robotic monotone. Leave while you still can. Panic set in immediately. Karen grabbed her phone and called a tech support hotline, explaining the situation in a shaky voice. The representative listened patiently before suggesting she reset her entire system. Desperate, Karen followed their instructions, unplugging everything and starting from scratch. For a brief moment, she thought she'd fixed the problem. But Jake was always one step ahead. Within minutes of Karen resetting her devices, he reactivated the hack, regaining full control. This time, he added a personal touch. As Karen sat on her couch, exhausted and defeated, her TV suddenly turned on by itself. The screen displayed a single sentence in large block letters. Stop parking in my driveway. Her blood ran cold. For the first time, Karen realized this wasn't random bad luck or technical glitches. It was personal. Someone was targeting her deliberately. Fear gripped her chest as she scrambled to call the police again. When they arrived, she showed them the message on her TV, her hands trembling as she pointed at the screen. This isn't a prank anymore, she insisted. Someone's stalking me. They're inside my house, messing with my stuff. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. Without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report. We'll keep an eye out, one of them promised, though his tone suggested he didn't take her claims seriously. After they left, Karen locked all her doors and windows, pulling the curtains shut tightly. She sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight, too afraid to sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Who could possibly hate her enough to do this? And why? Meanwhile, Jake watched from across the street, hidden behind his curtains. He hadn't expected Karen to react so strongly to the message, and guilt gnawed at him. Part of him wanted to stop, to leave her alone and let things return to normal. But another part, the angrier part, refused to back down. If Karen truly believed someone was haunting her, then she deserved it. She had brought this on herself. Over the next few days, Karen's behavior deteriorated further. She stopped leaving her house altogether, canceling plans with friends and avoiding conversations with neighbors. Rumors spread quickly through the community about her bizarre antics. Some people whispered that she was losing her mind. Others joked about her haunted house. No one took her claims of being targeted seriously. Jake noticed the shift in how people treated her. Once admired for her charm and generosity, Karen was now viewed as unstable and unreliable. It was exactly what he had hoped for. But instead of feeling triumphant, he felt hollow. Watching Karen isolate herself made him realize how destructive his actions had become. He had wanted to teach her a lesson, not destroy her life. One afternoon, Brian visited unexpectedly. He walked into Jake's kitchen and set down a 6-pack of beer. "We need to talk," he said firmly. Jake groaned. "Not this again." "Yes, this again," Brian shot back. "Look at you, man. You're obsessed. You barely sleep, you don't go outside, and you spend all your time messing with Karen. When does it end? What's your plan here?" Jake stared at the floor, avoiding his friend's gaze. "I don't know," he admitted softly. "I just wanted her to understand how it feels to be disrespected, to lose control." "Well, congratulations," Brian said sarcastically. "You've succeeded, but at what cost? You're turning into someone I barely recognize. Is this really who you want to be?" Jake didn't answer. He poured himself a glass of water trying to steady his nerves. Brian's words hit close to home, forcing him to confront the reality of what he'd done. Revenge had started as a way to regain power, but it had spiraled into something much darker. Instead of teaching Karen a lesson, he had become the villain in his own story. That night, Jake lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. Memories of his earlier interactions with Karen flooded his mind. The polite requests, the ignored notes, the dismissive looks. He remembered how small and powerless she had made him feel. But he also remembered the joy he used to find in simple pleasures, reading the newspaper, drinking coffee on his porch, chatting with Brian about nothing in particular. Those moments seemed distant now, replaced by anger and obsession. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to consider stopping. Maybe Brian was right. Maybe it was time to let go. But letting go meant admitting defeat, acknowledging that Karen had hurt him more than he cared to admit. Could he really walk away without seeing this through to the end? As dawn broke, Jake made a decision. He wouldn't escalate things any further. He would deactivate the device controlling Karen's car and delete the software accessing her smart home system. It wasn't forgiveness, it was surrender. He couldn't keep living like this, consumed by hatred and revenge. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on, without hiding behind pranks or tricks. With a heavy heart, Jake powered up his laptop and began dismantling the tools he had built. Each click of the mouse felt like closing a chapter of his life, one he wasn't proud of but couldn't undo. By the time he finished, the sun was fully risen, casting golden light across his living room. Jake stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of peace. Whether Karen would recover from her ordeal remained to be seen. But for now, Jake had taken the first step toward reclaiming his own life. It didn't take long for Karen to discover traces of Jake's meddling. A local tech expert she hired to investigate the strange occurrences traced the interference back to a signal originating near Jake's property. At first, Karen couldn't believe it. Jake? Quiet, unassuming Jake? The same man who had always been polite, even overly accommodating, when asking her not to park in his driveway? It seemed impossible. But as the evidence mounted, doubt turned into certainty. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Karen marched over to Jake's house. She knocked loudly on his door, her fists pounding against the wood with barely contained rage. When Jake opened the door, he froze, surprised to see her standing there with fire in her eyes. "We need to talk," Karen snapped, pushing past him into the living room without waiting for an invitation. Jake closed the door slowly, his heart racing. He had known this moment might come, but he hadn't expected it so soon, or with such intensity. "What's going on?" Jake asked cautiously, trying to sound calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Don't play dumb with me," Karen spat, whirling around to face him. "I know what you've been doing. You've been messing with my car, hacking into my house, scaring me half to death. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" Jake hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. For weeks, he had imagined how this conversation might go, rehearsing excuses and denials in his head. But now, staring into Karen's furious face, those words felt hollow. He opened his mouth to speak but found himself at a loss. "Well?" Karen demanded, crossing her arms. "Are you going to deny it?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. There was no point in lying anymore. "Okay, fine," he admitted, reluctantly. "Yes, it was me." Karen's jaw dropped, though her expression quickly shifted from shock to anger. "Why would you do something like that?" she shouted. "What gives you the right to invade my life and make me feel like I'm losing my mind?" Jake straightened up, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. "Because you didn't care about mine," he shot back. "You parked in my driveway every single day, ignoring my requests, dismissing my feelings. You treated me like I didn't matter, like my needs were less important than your convenience. And when I tried to talk to you about it, you acted like it was my fault for being upset." Karen blinked, momentarily taken aback by his outburst. Then her features hardened again. So you decided to ruin my life instead? That makes perfect sense, she said sarcastically. You know, I thought you were just a pushover, someone who wouldn't stand up for himself. Turns out you're worse. You're vindictive and petty. The accusation stung, hitting closer to the truth than Jake cared to admit. He clenched his fists, struggling to keep his emotions in check. I wasn't trying to ruin your life, he muttered. I just wanted you to understand how it feels to be disrespected, to lose control. And look where that got us, Karen retorted, gesturing wildly between them. You've made my life hell for weeks, and for what, to prove a point? Congratulations, Jake, you win. Are you happy now? Jake didn't answer. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. For all his planning and scheming, he hadn't anticipated how empty victory would feel. Seeing Karen standing there, hurt and angry, made him question everything. Karen paced back and forth, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. You need to apologize, she said finally, stopping to glare at him. And you need to stop whatever it is you're doing. If you don't, I'll report you to the police. I'll tell everyone what you've done. You'll regret it. Jake swallowed hard, knowing she meant it. As much as he hated to admit it, Karen held all the power now. If she followed through on her threat, his reputation, and possibly his freedom, would be at stake. He nodded slowly, defeated. Fine, he said quietly. I'll stop. I'm sorry. Karen studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she relaxed, slightly. Good, she said firmly. This isn't over, though. I'll be watching you, Jake. One wrong move and I won't hesitate to act. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Jake stood frozen in place, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading into the night. The confrontation left him shaken, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Relief washed over him at the thought of ending the feud, but guilt lingered, gnawing at his conscience. Over the next few days, Jake kept his promise, leaving Karen alone. He deleted the apps and dismantled the devices he had used to torment her, erasing any trace of his actions. Without the constant distraction of plotting pranks, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Had he really become the person Brian warned him about? Someone consumed by anger and revenge? Brian noticed the change immediately when he stopped by for a visit. You seem different, he remarked, sitting down at Jake's kitchen table. What's going on? I confronted Karen, Jake admitted, leaning against the counter. She knows it was me. Brian raised an eyebrow. How did that go? Not well, Jake replied with a bitter laugh. She threatened to call the cops if I try anything again. Honestly, I don't blame her. I went too far. Brian nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, you kind of did. But hey, at least you stopped before things got even worse. That's something, right? Jake shrugged, unsure if he agreed. Stopping felt like the bare minimum, a necessary step to avoid further consequences, but it didn't undo the damage he had caused. Karen's trust in him was shattered, and he doubted she would ever forgive him. Worse still, their feud had drawn unwanted attention from the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about the argument, fueled by Karen's dramatic recounting of events to anyone who would listen. Some neighbors sided with her, calling Jake unstable and dangerous. Others remained neutral, unwilling to take sides in what they saw as a petty dispute. Either way, Jake felt isolated, cut off from the community he had once considered home. He tried reaching out to Karen one last time, hoping to smooth things over. Standing on her porch, he knocked gently, bracing himself for rejection. When she answered, her expression was cold and distant. What do you want? She asked flatly. I just wanted to say I'm sorry again, Jake said sincerely. I know. I messed up and I regret everything I did. I hope someday you can forgive me. Karen stared at him for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she spoke. Maybe someday, she said softly. But not today. With that, she closed the door, leaving Jake standing alone on the porch. He took a deep breath, feeling a mix of sadness and acceptance. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily if it came at all, but he knew he had to live with the consequences of his actions. As the weeks passed, Jake began making changes in his own life. He spent less time obsessing over Karen and more time focusing on himself. He reconnected with old hobbies, started exercising regularly, and even volunteered at a local shelter. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild a sense of purpose, separate from the feud that had consumed him for so long. Karen, meanwhile, continued to recover from the ordeal. Though she remained wary of Jake, she also worked to repair her relationships with neighbors and friends. Life in the suburb returned to its usual rhythm, though the scars of the conflict lingered beneath the surface. For both Jake and Karen, the experience served as a painful reminder of the cost of entitlement and revenge. Neither emerged unscathed, but perhaps in time they could find peace.